Good evening. Welcome to the fourth lecture of the online lecture series on language, literature, and cultural studies organized by the English Language Teachers Interaction Forum, ELTIF. Let me introduce myself. I'm Dr. Praveen, coordinator of the online programs of ELTIF. For almost a decade, I've been associating myself with the programs of ELTIF. Now, Mr. Mohanan, higher secondary teacher, Puthuvaramba, and research scholar of Bharathidasan University, a member of the textbook preparations team of the State Council for Education Research and Training, and mentor of the Victor's channel, will now brief you about ELTIF.
Good evening, everyone. We know ELTIF is an organization which has always been with the less privileged and the people who are not empowered. It has been there with the rural people, empowering the sections, all sections of the society through English. And we know English is no longer just a language for communication. It is also a tool for empowerment. ELTIF knows for certain that using English, it can empower the people, all sections of the society. Realizing this potential role of English, ELTIF has always used English to help people to meet the challenges of the century. ELTIF works not only among the teachers and the student community, but also among the people of all strata of society, ranging from the housewives, the most neglected classes, to the highly elite people. The way ELTIF reaches out the people is quite unique. ELTIF has its own strategies to implement the facilitation of learning in a very non-conventional way. It uses songs, stories, and whatever materials they get, utilize all the materials for teaching English in a very novel, creative way. And they create novel experiences in the classrooms for the learners to make teaching learning process very effective and interesting. ELTIF also conducts seminar for all English-loving people. We know ELTIF has conducted various empowerment programs among the tribal people and the members of Kudumbasri. Or rather, there's no segment of the society which has not been benefited by ELTIF. During this pandemic, ELTIF has taken the new challenge of teaching, of reaching out the people through online platform. Thank you all.
Thank you, Mr. Mohanan. Today's speaker is Dr. Prof.E.V.Ramakrishnan, formerly of Central University of Gujarat. He will be delivering a lecture on poetry as voice, tone, and texture, an approach to the languages of poetry. I now request Dr. Srihari, faculty of the Department of English, Payyanur College, who has a keen interest in poetry and criticism, to welcome and introduce today's speaker. Dr. Srihari.
Thank you, Dr. Praveen. With great pleasure, let me introduce Dr. E.V. Ramakrishnan to this august audience. Good evening, one and all. Professor E.V. Ramakrishnan was Professor and Dean, School of Language, Literature and Culture Studies, Central University of Gujarat, Gandhinagar. He was Professor Emeritus as well in the same university. He is a bilingual poet and critic and a translator. He has published 7 books of criticism in Malayalam, including Aksharavum Adhunikadayum, for which he received the coveted Kerala Sahitya Akademi Award in 1995. And Malayalam novelinde Deshakalangal, for which he received the prestigious Order Award in 2018. He has published 4 works of criticism in English and has also edited 12 volumes of literary criticism. Among his critical books are Locating Indian Literature, Texts, Traditions and Translations, and Indigenous Imaginaries, Literature, Region, Modernity. He has published 4 volumes of poetry in English, the latest being Tips for Living in an Expanding Universe, 2018. He is the president of Comparative Literature Association of India and a vice president of International Comparative Literature Association of India. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Srihari. Dr. Ramakrishnan, sir, you can take over.
Thank you. Dr. Praveen, Dr. Mohan, Dr. Srihari, who is actually a very close friend. We are from Payanur, Professor Bhaskaran Nair. I hope he is also part of the audience. I have known him for many years, and I am also familiar with the wonderful work LTIS has been doing, though I live and work outside Kerala. I have had many occasions to associate myself with the programs of LTIS. So it's a great pleasure for me to join this webinar series. And in this distressing days of pandemic, you have been doing really commendable work by carrying on with this education, particularly the spreading the word of English among those who have perhaps had no occasion to learn formally, you see, the skills of English. So a forum like this is very important because it supplements the work in the classroom and takes up issues which perhaps are not addressed in a formal kind of school curriculum or college kind of curriculum. And that's why I thought, let me speak to you. I know this audience is largely made up of teachers of English and learners of English. There must be quite a few researchers or students. So I thought, let me talk of poetry as discourse. Let me discuss certain problems which come up in the classroom situation, as well as outside when we approach poetry. And some of you may be surprised to know that in these days of pandemic, poetry has been very, very popular on the online kind of platforms. There have been several poetry readings. I have also had occasions to be part of such readings, and there have been many anthologies which came. Many are still in the making. So poetry has actually been a source of perhaps consolation or camaraderie, a certain kind of sense of collectivity. See, all these are actually the things to be noted, because beyond the classroom, there is a context which also enters the classroom. I have actually titled my presentation as Poetry as Voice, Tone, and Texture, an approach to the language or languages of poetry. And when I conceived this entire topic, I thought it is important to emphasize a certain approach to language, not as a formal kind of structure. Those who are familiar with me are also, or with my work, may also be familiar with my use of Mikhail Bakhtin and his ideas. So some of them will definitely enter my presentation today. One of the things Bakhtin actually tells in many of his books, in his study of Dostoevsky, he has largely focused on the novel, but many of his insights are relevant for the study of poetry as well. In the 1920s, if you know about the linguistic turn in literary theory or critical theory, that happens around the 1920s, when Ferdinand Saussure, he actually, in his famous book, Course in General Linguistics, it came out in 1916. In fact, he never wrote, he only lectured to his students. And it is his students who actually compiled his lecture notes and published as a book. And he had fundamental insights to give regarding the nature of language, the structure of language. And one of the things he actually tells us is language as a sign system is made up of a kind of fundamental structural regulations, which he calls lang, and there is also language in everyday use, which he calls parole. But his basic object of study was lang, the structure of any language. A language has a structure, its rule, grammar, its the manner in which the usage of language takes place. And elaborately, they were studied, and structural linguistics emerged as a major discipline in the subsequent decades. And we have so much elaborate kind of treatises, tracts on the study of the very structure of language. So one of the things structural linguistics does is to conceive of language as a closed system. This was the critique which Bakhtin and many others, Voloshinov, and later on you will find this was advanced by many other scholars. So, and there is a long tradition of Russian formalism. Some of you must be familiar with the names of Jacobson, and Russia had a very strong foundation in linguistics. And so Bakhtin and many of these scholars very strongly critiqued this formalist approach to language, because it sees language as basically as a closed system, as a kind of finished product which we need to study. Whereas language exists as something which is ever in flux. Language exists as something which is not something which can be summarized or totally regulated by rules and regulations. And the objective study of language reduce language to a kind of abstract phenomenon. And this is where we need to return to the idea of parole. Perhaps the word Bakhtin and many others use these days is discourse. How does language operate in everyday life. Language in everyday life perhaps doesn't require, you see, we never learned grammar formally before we started speaking our mother tongue or even other languages. And our relationship to language is not passive. We actively create language as we actually speak. So a speaking person is a concrete, embodied being. A speaking person is contextually situated in a place and time, in a social, political, cultural kind of extended locale, which enters his everyday words. So this is where discourse comes in. The fundamental definition of discourse is language in use, language in everyday use, language which can be in special kind of uses also. So language exists basically in a kind of discursive formation. And we can actually, if there are questions later on, I can elaborate, but my time may not allow me to go into great detail. And the basic fact which we need to take note of is as we talk language, we are performing an act. There is an element of performance in the very manner in which we actually use language, the resources of language. And if we actually accept that language exists in society as discourse, and it actually is performed in countless, infinite number of contexts all the time, we will also actually understand there is no center where language actually is. There is absolutely no center which controls language. Language is every speaker is a center in that sense. And two things are important here. You see, not even the intention of the speaker can be totally controlled by the speaker. I may actually utter a sentence, but it enters the world, it moves out of my frame, and it may be interpreted in many number of ways. So language as performed goes out into the world and finds its meaning. Meaning is always a production in the larger context of the reception of what is spoken. And this outward bound utterances, utterance is a word Bhaktin uses, utterances are always bound by the context in which they actually are generated. And two things, again, I have already, if you look at the frame, you see, there are extra verbal elements that enter our speech all the time. Extra verbal elements which, in a way, there is a very interesting example given by Voloshinov, and I think a Marxist theory of language. Now, imagine two people are sitting in a room, and one man says, well, now, you know the dictionary meaning of the word well, you see, W-E-L-L. Now, there is nothing ambiguous about, but then what did he mean by saying well? You see, here, one of the possible, there can be many contexts in which such an utterance can be made. Maybe it was the month of May, maybe spring was about to actually begin, but the winter was a prolonged winter. And that day, it was snowing very badly. So one man tells another, out of exasperation, you see, such a prolonged winter, it is still snowing in this month of May. So he only says, well, now that utterance needs a context to make sense of. It's actually the extra verbal elements. There are lots of extra verbal elements which enter that utterance. Only then you can interpret. And this can be taken as a model for any utterance. You see, an utterance can be a 3,000-page epic. It can be a 400-page novel. It can be a 5,000+ word essay or short story. So an utterance can take literary form. There can be genres of literature. They also are utterances. But what we need to notice, a poem or a novel or a play, it actually is related to all other forms which exist in the same language. A poem which is spoken, which is written. A written poem is also basically a spoken poem. And it's related to all other poems in the language. It's not something which exists in isolation. It exists in the larger context of the language itself. This is one thing what many people do not understand. If we are teaching in the classroom a poem by, let's say, Sylvia Plath, or maybe W.H. Auden, or maybe Alfred Tennyson, in his context, there is this larger context of the entire English poetry. And it may have to be brought into the context through several means. So let's actually understand how this whole, there is an essential dimension of society. There is a social element which enters, the utterances. We definitely know a sentence is spoken. Suppose in Malayalam, someone speaks a sentence. Sometimes you will be able to tell he comes from the north of Kerala, he comes from the coastal area of Kerala, he comes from Palghat area of Kerala. You see, nobody speaks like a printed kind of, grammatical sentence. So a sentence reveals a whole lot of social kind of, through its intonation, through the choice of words. So there is, and this needs to be taken into account while discussing poetry as well. We'll come to that. You see, any utterance, it evaluates reality. You see, there are, a discourse is something which also enables an individual to evaluate. It can be an ethical, this is right, this is wrong. I'm talking about discourse in real life. See, when we use language in real life, we may say this is unacceptable. This is, if somebody says that makes me sick, you see, it's a psychological kind of evaluation. There may be, this is something I never understand. So in discourses, there is an evaluative dimension as well. And they are again inherently social. Value judgments are inherently in the social context of the utterance. So the social is something which is, You see, primarily, that enables us to decode a sentence or an utterance. Only when we enter the social frame of an utterance, we actually are able to sort of grasp it as communication. Communication takes place only when the larger social dimension of the utterance is fulfilled. I would also like to, because we are concerned with how poetry functions, very often, how does intonation matter? Why am I talking about all these unrelated kind of matters? It may look unrelated, but when we use language in poetry, one of the things is the value judgment which we actually make in the real world may not be applicable to discourse in poetry, discourse in art in general. For example, this is wrong, this is right. You may actually say it in real life situation. In poetry, that becomes a little, or in the context of art, it becomes problematic. There are things which are spoken by a poem, in a poem, which actually happen because a certain convention operates in that poem. The poems do not actually come into being in a cultural vacuum. A poet belongs to, again, a social, political, cultural context. He writes in maybe in a particular meter, or he may not use meter. And that's where a whole lot of verbal discourse which appears in poetry has its own history. I'll be illustrating it further in the context of English language. Now let's take English language. You see, if you look at the metrical structure of English, one of the most important thing that happens in English poetry is the emergence of iambic pentameter as a standard poetic meter. This happens around the Renaissance period. It begins with Chaucer almost, 15th century. And then, of course, when Shakespeare uses blank verse, he is using the entire Shakespearean drama is iambic pentameter. You see, again in Dryden, in Pope, you find iambic pentameter becoming extremely important. So there is an entire uninterrupted, continuous development of a particular metrical pattern in the English language. This is a remarkable phenomenon. We are unaware of it. When you are teaching Tennyson, why is Tennyson using a meter which has been in existence for almost 400 to 450 years? If you are teaching T.S. Eliot in the classroom, or Sylvia Plath in the classroom, or Emily Dickinson in the classroom, Emily Dickinson, again 19th century, but she doesn't use iambic pentameter. So, is there something significant about Emily Dickinson not using iambic pentameter? You see, iambic pentameter became the standard poetic unit, the standard line in which poetry is written through a certain kind of what you call social, political, and cultural confluence of many, many factors. We need to actually understand this is a new social formation, a new intelligentsia, a new bourgeoisie society actually comes into being. London becomes one of the world cities, and English becomes one of the very strong emerging language. English is still getting standardized. It is yet in the process of being made. But in that context, the very idea that a new meter becomes central to the composition of poetry, it had a very important function. Actually, the emergence of iambic pentameter has something to do with. You see, this again comes, if you look at the question of meter, the earlier English poetry was largely accentual kind of meter. We will look at it. I will make a distinction between these accentual kind of meters, which are still very much available. You see, you can see accentual meter even today in nursery rhymes, ballads, folk slogans, football chants. You see, they are still very much there. Giving, you see, look at any nursery rhyme. Humpty Dumpty sat on a wall. Humpty Dumpty had a great fall. This is accentual meter. This is not iambic pentameter. Humpty Dumpty sat wall. Again, Humpty Dumpty had great fall. See, this is accentual meter. This kind of accentual meter is visible in ballads. You can see some of the new ballads also, but it's basically a ballad kind of form. Folk songs, even slogans. You see, people who shout slogans on the roads also do it. They are chanting slogans. There is a rhythm there. In football, Europe is famous for huge football gatherings, and they will be shouting, you see, continuously throughout the game. And that also you will find take the form of assume a kind of accentual metric pattern. But how did iambic pentameter take over the entire English poetry? Whether it's Milton or Pope or is it Wordsworth, there is this continuous tradition of iambic pentameter because it has become the hegemonic kind of form. Perhaps when at the time of Reformation or Renaissance, when this got standardized, there was this great desire for a certain kind of worldview. A certain kind of worldview is written into this metrical pattern. You see, this iambic kind of form comes from Greek Latin. You see, it has a recurring kind of history even outside England. And you also have, you see, it has a certain kind of ability to impose uniformity, harmony, though poetry always is very carefully crafted. You will very often find the use of iambic pentameter gives a sense of what we call effortlessness or eloquence. But the basic function iambic pentameter in a way does, its basic function in English poetry is to create a certain sense of continuity and a certain sense of Englishness. You see, we know by 18th century English has already become a certain, it has become a nation. It has already reclaimed an entire diverse, multiple tradition into one canonical kind of tradition. So this meter in a way contributes towards standardizing, naturalizing, canonizing an experiential world. A certain experiential world is codified into the very structure of this meter. Maybe such things do happen even in other, when Ezhuthachan wrote in Malayalam, maybe there was, you see, some of these Dravidian meters, Kega or Kakali or many of these, in the large number of folk, Nadan Patugal, you see, which, but he did this codifying, in a way standardizing. After Ezhuthachan, we have a literary kind of metrical pattern in Kerala, in Malayalam. So something similar happens in English as well. Now, we need to actually say that something happens at the beginning of 20th century, and that was the rejection of iambic pentameter. You see, the rejection of iambic pentameter, modernist poetry in a way broke this continuity of iambic pentameter. And it had a tremendous impact in the way in which we read poetry, in the way in which we relate to poetry, the way in which we actually, there are 4 or 5 elements I would actually, you see, Pound was highly critical of iambic pentameter. Pound, you see, in ABC of reading, he talks about, you see, this, the manner in which a certain kind of perspective, you see, when you use iambic pentameter, a certain perspective on reality is inbuilt into the very structure of that metrical pattern. So breaking iambic pentameter was central to the modernist radical break. You see, modernism reimagined the world. Modernism, to that extent, vers liber, or what you actually call free words. You see, one of the things modernism did, one of the things modern poetry did at the beginning of the 20th century was to shatter, break the iron hold of the iambic pentameter. You also know in prose, when this entire stream of consciousness, you know, you see, there was this Joycean kind of, you see, narrative, which again broke the linearity. A certain kind of linear narration actually was rejected. Perhaps something similar happens in imagist poetry. Imagist poetry continuously reinvents the very idiom of poetry, and you can actually, I can give any number of, this is that very famous poem about the metro station, only 2 lines. The apparition of these faces in the crowd, petals on a wet black bow. See, there is a denial of, you see, narrative here. There is a kind of compression of language, an extreme kind of, you see, situation built into the very idea of what a poem is. But my larger question is, when iambic pentameter, its hegemony was questioned, its way of abstracting experience, its way of imposing uniformity and harmony was rejected, poetry was reinventing itself. And accentual patterns, accentual meter also came back. You will find intonation becomes extremely central to poetry which was written in the 20th century. When we teach poetry in the classroom, very often I will actually illustrate some of these poems with 2 or 3 poems. One poem I am taking up is W.H. Auden's this Muse de Beaux-Arts, That's a very famous poem, Museum of Fine Arts. I will also take up another poem. This is by Louis Glick, Messengers. She is the Nobel Prize winner this year. I will take one poem by her, so that you have one poem written in the 21st century, one poem written in 20th century. Of course, Auden actually is more in the canonical pattern, but he is not exactly. There is this iambic pentameter intruding into the rhythm of his words, but largely he is using free words. So I would be using these two poems for some of the analysis, because I will also illustrate the very concept of tone and texture. Why it is important to look at intonation. Intonation basically is related to the spoken quality of the poem, spoken quality of any utterance. Intonation determines meaning. One of the things perhaps you actually understand is in the classroom itself, a lot of communication takes place not through language. We teachers are experts in face reading, so we always know our students and how they actually respond. Though in this webinar, I cannot read many of your faces, but a speaker can always gauge the moods of the audience. See, when something is spoken, a whole lot of meaning actually is communicated through the intonation, and the intonation cannot be written, you see. So that is why a whole set of lines in the poem, how do you read it? That becomes extremely important in the classroom. Maybe even poems by Milton, you will find some of them, if they are read in the proper manner, half the meaning will be communicated, very, very effectively. There are syllable, where do the syllables break? Where are the stresses falling? It's very important. There is always, in poetry, a kind of tension operates through what actually, there is a control. There is a poetic line is trying to control experience through its utterance. And there is also a certain kind of resistance to this control. So you will find a meter, even free verse. Free verse has to actually move within certain constraints, and language tries to break through those constraints. So you will find intonation creates expectation. There is a certain expectation built through the, if someone uses a Sanskrit meter, Anushtup. Anushtup carries association with a whole worldview. Vedas or Upanishads. So lots of things have been written in Anushtup. It's a meter which has a history. Now, can you write, suppose I write a poem about my everyday experience of boredom, everyday experience of waiting for a bus, waiting for a train. You see the inherent contradiction between the meter and the content. You see, Anushtup anticipates a kind of profound treatment of a subject. The same is, you see, suppose you are familiar with Kunjan Nambiar, you know Autantulan, Tarangini is a meter he uses. Suppose you put Tarangini, it has a kind of dancing kind of rhythm built into the very structure. Now, suppose you describe a very profound sublime experience with that kind of meter, the contradiction will either spoil the entire poem or will make it maybe a new kind of beginning. That's so there is a meter is a language. You see, my topic is the languages of poetry. Please understand that a poem is not written in English. A poem is written in free verse. A poem is written in pentameter, or poem is written in an accentual meter, or poem is written in none of these. Maybe it actually uses an altogether is a new invented form. So the language of poetry has a significance which goes into the very structuring of the experience itself. One thing that metrical patterns do, see, we know, even in Malayalam, a lot of critics are angry because the young generation do not follow metrical patterns. They will say they have no knowledge of metrical patterns. That is one accusation. But they do not understand that a meter carries its burden of 500 years of history. Maybe even before you start speaking, the meter starts speaking. So there is a young poet in Malayalam, very well established, you know how that young, Joseph. He has written a poem called Pangalude Bible. What is there in his sister's Bible, what is not there, it's a wonderful poem. Many of you must be familiar. It cannot be written in a Kega or Tarangini or what you call Anushto. If Joseph had chosen to write it in an established conventional meter, that poem would actually have not come into being. The poem comes into being because it breaks a certain ordering of experience through established hegemonic forms. The poem's content itself is something which actually is too radical to be accommodated in the conventional meters. So when Barth says one of the functions of metrical patterns is to naturalize experience, he is talking about how, if you read mythologies, you'll find lots of, you see, one of the things he talks about how in France, French government uses maybe a photograph, you see, in the newspaper or an advertisement. A French flag is actually waving in the air, and there is a French soldier saluting the French flag, and this French soldier is a black man. Now it is loaded with meanings. It is loaded with ideology. It's loaded with mythology. It's loaded with unspoken things. You see, this unspoken is always foregrounded in a photograph. You see, a photograph always captures what is essentially unspoken. And this happens in a poem as well. You see, what is unspoken, it actually gets communicated through the tone or the intonation. That's where the intonation becomes extremely important. Maybe, you see, we need to actually look at one or two, because I do feel, let me read at least these two poems. And you see, W.H. Auden's this poem, it's conventional, it's canonical, but in a way it's also a masterpiece of English poetry. Museo de Bosa, Spanish, it actually means Museum of Fine Arts. I'll read the poem. You can look at the frame. About suffering, they were never wrong, the old masters. How well they understood its human position, how it takes place while someone else is eating or opening a window or just walking dully along, how when the aged are reverently, passionately waiting for the miraculous birth, there always must be children who did not specially want it to happen, skating on a pond at the edge of the wood. They never forgot that even the dreadful martyrdom must run its course anyhow in a corner, some untidy spot where the dogs go on with their doggy life and the torturous horse scratches its innocent behind on a tree. In Bruegel's Icarus, for instance, how everything turns away quite leisurely from the disaster. The plowman may have heard a splash, the forsaken cry, but for him it was not an important failure. The sun shone as it had to on the white legs, disappearing into the green water, and the expensive, delicate ship that must have seen something amazing, a boy falling out of the sky, had somewhere to get to and sailed calmly on. Now, why is this? This poem is an address. It's addressing you. Look at there is a conversational tone. About suffering, they were never wrong. The old masters, maybe in your room, somebody is speaking to you. You see, this addressivity, this is a quality of poetry. Unless you communicate this addressivity through loud reading, students will not understand a whole lot of what is communicated. And there are a lot of things, what is spoken. This poem was written in 1938, a very important year. We all know the World War began in 1939. We also need to remember Auden had been to China for 2 years almost. There was a Japanese-Chinese conflict going on. Spanish Civil War was going on, and he had actually witnessed, he was an ambulance man in Spanish Civil War. He had seen a lot of suffering in that last 3 years. About suffering, they were never wrong. So Auden goes to 3 major paintings produced in European art history. Bruegel, his very famous one painting he mentions is the census at Bethlehem. And Bruegel the younger, the son Bruegel, another painting, the Massacre of Innocents. And then again, the elder, the most famous painting he's mentioning is the Fall of Icarus, landscape with the Fall of Icarus. You see, I would like to illustrate the idea of texture. You see, what you cannot paraphrase is the texture of a poem. You can only feel it. What you cannot summarize and paraphrase is the tone of a poem. You need to feel it. You see, what I said as the addressivity. You see, when look at the construction, how well they understood its human position, how it takes place while someone else is eating or opening a window or just walking dully along. Actually, he's mentioning, there is a very famous painting called The Census at Bethlehem. We all know when Christ was born, you see, he was born in a cattle shed. Actually, they had gone to for a census which government had declared. And and in this painting, you can see Mary, who is pregnant, and Joseph is standing near her, and people are waiting for the birth of Christ. But a lot of small things are happening in the painting. This is a very small aspect of the small painting. You see, the scene of pregnant Mary, Joseph, and the elders, that actually is in a corner. Everywhere, you can see a lot of other things. Children are skating on a pond. And there are, there is pigs are being butchered, very untidy. In what you actually see on the left-hand corner is pigs being butchered. And then there is the dogs all over, and the dogs are living in look at the way he puts it, where the dogs go on with their doggy life. This is another painting, yeah, where a martyrdom of the Christians are, where a torturous horse is scratching its back against a tree. He uses the word scratches its innocent behind on a tree. Now look at this painting. You see, this is a very famous painting, Peter Bruegel's Landscape with the Fall of Icarus. You see, there is a green sea. It occupies the larger part of the painting. In fact, there is a ship, a luxurious ship which is moving. And if you look with great effort, you can see a leg disappearing into the ocean. You see, near the ship. And this is Icarus. Icarus who wanted to fly in the sky. And his wings melted. This is the story in the Greek myth. Daedalus created the wings, but he secured it with wax. Wax melted as Icarus moved toward the sun, and he died. He fell into the sea. You can see somebody fishing there. There is a farmer who is tilling. Everyday life goes on, and nothing, nobody seems to recognize an epochal event has taken place. Suffering is seen as an essential dimension of everyday world. You see, this texture, the texture can be seen in a painting even better. The tone on texture, these are words we can very easily apply to a painting. Look at the manner in which minor details are given, the color scheme, nature still. You see, there is a city seen from a very long distance. There are the vegetation, there is the horse, the tilling going on. You see, the texture of this painting definitely is in the tone, you see, the color scheme, there is a certain kind of framing quality. This framing quality, a balancing quality. The leg, you see, there is no close-up. The leg is minimally shown. Only in near the ship, you can see the legs disappearing. And that, let us look at the poem now. You see what second, you see, in Bruegel's Icarus, for instance, how everything turns away quite leisurely. You see, this is where the texture is capturing. Everything turns away quite leisurely from the disaster. This leisurely is a word we need to underline and italicize while discussing the poem. And then the plowman may have heard a splash, the forsaken cry, but for him it was not an important failure. The sun shone as it had to. Look at the construction of the line. The sun shone as it had to on the white legs. The sun cannot, you see, alter its path. Sun had to. There is a kind of inevitability to what's happening. Suffering is not something which is exaggerated in the human scheme of things. You see, the human suffering may not actually even be noted by the world of nature. In these days of pandemic, I think we need to understand neither the birds nor the animals nor the trees are suffering like us. It's only the human suffering, and who we exaggerate. The world doesn't end here. You see, we need to actually know our smallness. A poem is not about the painting. Poem is about suffering. Poem is about a kind of perspective towards what actually recurs in human life time after time. Then he says, and the expensive, delicate ship, look at the adjectives, that must have seen something amazing, a boy falling out of the sky. It's no usual sight, somebody falling right from the sky. The ship had somewhere to go, somewhere to get to, and sailed calmly on. No commentary. He only summarizes the texture of the painting and the poem. Here, I would highlight, if I am teaching the word leisurely, look at, can you replace it with some other word? Will the meaning be the same? If you replace it, the sun shone as it had to. He could have said the sun shone on the white legs disappearing into the green water. No, he said the sun shone as it had to. That is where the tone changes. The tone is capturing a certain, it's like a kind of sudden italicizing of the word. As you move in the poem, the tone is not the same. Tone changes. Tonal variations create movement in the poem. If there are no tonal variations, poem will be static. And that's where you see a certain ironical, relaxed tone, the expensive, delicate ship. Again, you see, there is all this. So what this Musée de Bossa, Museum of Fine Arts, he had gone to this, this is in Brussels. He had gone to see this Museum of Fine Arts maybe a month or two back. He had also gone through this great war experiences, etc. You see, when Bruegel painted this painting in around 1530, he was born in 1530, around 1560s or so, he is known as a great painter of peasant life, everyday life. So he has this Bruegel way of representing the everyday life of the peasants. And there is a proverb in Spanish, you see, which actually says, you see, about peasants. So peasant will go on as every. So in fact, in many of his paintings, he puts a kind of proverb. So there are so many extra textual details which create the poem, or which make the poem richer. If you know about his biographical situation, if you know the biography of Bruegel, I have no time to go into all that. There is so much, he lived during a time of great massacre. You see, so Bruegel knew there was a lot of suffering around his life, around you see, this was the time when Protestantism and Catholic faith, there was civil war-like situation in Spain. In Bruegel's time, again W.H. Auden's time, there is civil war-like situation. And that is what creates a certain tone. The texture comes from a certain treatment of the experience. It's a very, very rich kind of texture which captures a certain attitude towards suffering. Let me illustrate certain other things by Louis Gluck's. You see, Louis Gluck's, maybe I will stop in another 4 or 5 minutes. You see, Louis Gluck, she got Nobel Prize for Literature. She's an American poetess. She teaches in a university. She has lots of wonderful poems. I've chosen this poem mainly because it has a lot of silences. You see, if you had listened to me when I discussed Auden's poem, those silences, he doesn't say the masters, You see, he doesn't say who are the, you see, about suffering, they were never wrong. A statement, then the poem actually gains momentum. Look at this poem, Messengers. I'll read it loudly. Listen. You have only to wait. They will find you. The geese flying low over the marsh, glittering in black water, they find you. And the deer, how beautiful they are. As though their bodies did not impede them, slowly they drift into the open through the bronze panels of sunlight. Why would they stand so still if they were not waiting, almost motionless, until their cages rust? The shrubs shiver in the wind, squat and leafless. You have only to let it happen. That cry, release, release, like the moon wrenched out of earth and rising full in its circle of arrows until they come before you like dead things, saddled with flesh, and you above them, wounded and dominant. Very strong poem, but decoding in the classroom could actually pose problems because the poet, you may have to be familiar with the work of Louis Glick in the larger context. What kind of, every poet has a certain kind of manner of treating. You see, Stopping by Woods, I could have chosen Stopping by Woods on a Snowy Evening, wonderful poem by Robert Frost. Everything is spoken. It's also a poem which has a speaking quality. I could have chosen maybe a poem like the Emily Dickinson, where she says there is a certain slant of light, winter afternoons. But this poem, you see, let's look at the poem again. You have only to wait. They will find you. The geese flying low over the marsh, glittering in black water. They find you. You will notice the word, they find you. They will find you. You see, there is a menacing quality about this. They will find you. As if you are in hiding. As if you are watching them from a hiding place. And there is a marshy land. The geese are flying low and their images are glittering in black water. You see, water black. What glitters is the flying geese. And the person who is watching is waiting. And it's not geese alone. It's a slightly wild landscape. And the deer, how beautiful they are. As though their bodies did not impede them. Slowly they drift into the open through the bronze panels of sunlight. Suddenly the poem takes a flourish. It flourishes, a metaphorical flourish. Bronze panels of sunlight. And look at, you see, and the deer, then there is a kind of interruption, a dash. How beautiful they are. It's spoken. And the deer, how beautiful they are. As though the bodies did not impede them. Slowly they drift into the open. This drifting, geese, they are flying low over the marsh. Deer, they are drifting into the open as if their bodies do not impede. So it suggests that your bodies are impeded. You see, they have freedom of movement, whereas you as a human being cannot move where they are actually located. And then covering all of you is the larger image of the bronze panels of sunlight. then the tone changes. Then the poems, a certain tonal variation. This is typical of Glick. Why would they stand so still if they were not waiting? The idea of waiting. Why would they stand so still if they were not waiting? Almost motionless until their cages rest. The shrubs shiver in the wind, squat and leafless. You see, suddenly with the arrival of the word cages, and they are motionless, there is a menacing quality which the opening lines had. It deepens now. The shrubs shiver in the wind, squat and leafless. Landscape is bleak now. The beauty of the duck flying or the deer, you see, almost drifting, all that is gone. What we are now face to face with is rusting cages and shriveled kind of shivering shrubs. And then the tone again. You see, there is an intrusion of the speaker. You is a very menacing in poetry. You, of course, is a word which carries a lot of suggestions. You only have to let it happen. That cry, release, release. You see, this is a repetition. At the beginning of the poem, we have seen there is this repetition of the word, they will find you, they find you. Now, who is crying out? That cry. Is it the animal, which is, already there is the idea of a hunter in the poem here. And that's why the menacing, the sunlight was benevolent, but the moon ranged out of earth and rising full in its circle of arrows. This circle of arrows suggests Diana. There are mythical kind of maybe dimensions, but even if you don't know, the poem makes it sense. There is a menacing quality which deepens. Who is calling out? Is it the animals? Of course, are trapped. And if maybe the person who was watching is not a poet, a hunter, and animal always is aware of it ever lives in danger of death. Animals always know they are any moment they can be trapped, they can be killed. So this idea of release, obviously that cry comes from animals, but it also, that is where Glick actually creates a very complex texture. The texture here includes human being as well. For this, you have to go to the last answer, until they come before you. Finally, the animals come before you. She doesn't say you have killed them. She only says, like dead things, saddled with flesh. Flesh is a term which has biblical kind of biblical significance, many undertones. And suddenly saddled is a word which you are saddled with some burden. But animals, they are killed mainly for their flesh. And of course, you have succeeded. And you above them. But you are the one wounded and dominant. The word wounded actually creates this is where iambic pentameter would have created a human perspective where the animal world is totally outside. Messengers, see the title. That is how, you see, messenger usually brings a message. You see, animals here, if they have any message, if they are messengers, they are bringing a very unhappy message for you. Let me stop here. We can actually discuss, but I have translated this poem into Malayalam, I will just read it out and stop here so that you will also have a taste of the poem in Malayalam. So you will also know how there can be any number of translations. Messengers. Sandesha Vahakar. Somebody who brings message. Sandesha Vahakar. Ningal Katu Ninnal Matram Madi. Our Ningale Kandetu. Karutta Vellatil Minnikonde. Chadupini Mugalilude. Talnu Parakunna Vatugal. Our Ningale Kanu. I have reordered some lines. I will reread. Ningal Katu Ninnal Matram Madi. Our Ningale Kandetu. Karutta Vellatil Minnikonde. Chadupini Mugalilude. Talnu Parakunna Vatugal. Our Ningale Kanu. Pinna Manugal. Avake enda Aragana. So Sharirangal Avare Vilaka to the Vole. Paduke Puratekava Urugunu. Surya Velichatinda Vengala Palakagalilude. Kathirikan Allengil Indinanava Itramatram Nischalamai Nilkunadu. Anangade Kudugal Turimbikunaduvere. Kutichedigal Katil Virakunu. Padungi Yodungi. Ilagalillade. Squat and leafless. Yanadina Padungi Yodungi. Ilagalillade. Udunguda Randamate stands of Icon. Pinna Manugal Avake and the Aragana. So Sharirangal Avare Vilakata the Vole. Impede. Paduke Puraketava Puratekava Urugunu. Surya Velichatinda Vengala Palagalilude. Kathirikan Alengil Endinanava Itramatram Nishalamai Nilkunadu. Anangade Kudugal Turimbikunaduvere. Kutichedigal Katil Virakunu. Padungi Yodungi Ilagalillade. Ningaladine Anuvadichal Matram Madi. Anilavli Puratek Vidu. Bhumil Nin Kirieduta Chandran. Sharavrutangalil Uyarnu Verumbole. These are again lines ranged out of earth and rising full in its circle of arrows. Bhumil Ninna Kirieduta Chandran. Range is a very strong word in English. Urupashe, I have not been able to bring that same kind of effect, but still I felt there is wrenching, blood coming out, bleeding. The Bhumil Ninna Kirieduta Chandran Sharavurtangalil Uyarnu Verumbole. Ningaluda Minnil Ava Etunnaduvere. Mamsa Bharatode. Marichavarai. Ningal Avaiku Mugalil. Murivet Prabhavatode. Until they come before you, like dead things, saddled with flesh, and you above them, wounded and dominant. Ningaluda Minnil Avayetunnaduvere. Mamsa Bharatode. Marichavarai. Ningal Avaiku Mugalil. Murivet Prabhavatode. Prabhavam, dominance, hegemony, strong, strength. You see, words have lot of meaning. The tone changes. One reason I took this poem is it doesn't have, it deepens, it looks in many directions. It actually, the messenger, the message, this is a warning, you see, and maybe she doesn't make lot of things very clear. The silences in the poem speak. There are gaps. That's why the tone is what leads you to the central kind of meaning. So let me stop here. I could have actually read a few other poems, but I felt I have largely communicated what I wanted to communicate. If you see, the discourse in poetry is a matter of interpreting the texture, the tone, the voice quality. You see, the poems have to be actually the spoken voice itself. It's a signifier. the words alone are not the signifiers. A whole lot of other signifiers are actually operating within the poem. So the meter definitely. So beyond the meter can actually disrupt what you want to. That's why she doesn't use the iambic pentameter. A poem like this may not have come through in iambic pentameter. So let's stop here, and maybe if there are questions, I will answer them. Thank you.
Yes, sir. We'll take a couple of questions.
Yeah.
Yes, Lena, Dr. Lena.
Good evening, sir.
Good evening.
Sir, it is crystal clear presentation, so that all the participants gave us feedback that it was very crystal clear, and they all liked it well. I have a question, sir.
Please.
All the time when we read old poems, we feel it is good, and when we read today's poem, we feel that is you already defined all these things. Still, I have this question to my mind, like our old movie songs. All the a middle-aged person always tell that it is much good, or old songs is good, and here they don't. You already defined all these things. Still, does it really our attitude? Does it matter, or something else, or do we have that capacity to appreciate our new generation poets? What is the main thing behind that, sir?
See, there is a certain horizon of experience within which you actually formulate your idea of what is a poem, what is a novel, what's a drama. You see, definitely you have the when you go and look at a Picasso painting, and if you are only seen Ravi Verma paintings, you will definitely, in Kerala, a lot of people say it is like modern art. But modern art is such a complex way of representing. And if modern art actually made a difference in the kind of what you call representation, there are reasons for, the visual representation has a long history. So you have every right to say the poem, Ashan is a great poet, Velopalli is a great poet, or Wordsworth is a great poet. But if you have habits of understanding poetry built on your familiarity with a certain canonical model, it actually is if you don't grow, you don't internalize new modes of relating to experience, definitely there will be resistance to new things. So this resistance is a fact everywhere. I'm not saying that is necessarily good or bad. I mean, one can, it only is, one reason is their exposure. You see, you need exposure. You need a certain kind of exposure to varieties of art experience. You see, it's not merely poetry. You should also actually, if you watch classic, modern films, maybe Tarkovsky, or I mean, in Kerala, lots of people watch modern. Even today, the classics in films, Kurosawa or all, you see, they in a way allow you to alter your way of seeing. So poetry demands a certain kind of cultivated sensibility. It's not as if you know Malayalam, so you can read every poem. It's not that. You need to actually cultivate, reinvent your sensibility continuously. This is true of music. You see, there are innovations. T.M. Krishna doesn't sing the way Shamangudi sang. innovation is inherent in every artistic kind of the development. So perhaps Kerala has a certain kind of deep-rooted resentment, I would say, towards anything which is radically new. Anything radically new would, if you can domesticate and make it part of the canon, then they will be quite happy. But lots of people seem to actually resist something. But this avant-garde, this radically new, even when Edutachan wrote, I am sure lots of people must have found it unacceptable. That's not actually, it was not instant kind of acceptance. We know the reception of Kumaran Ashan. Ashan was not accepted overnight. It took 50 years of reading to make Ashan, the most significant 20th century Malayalam poet. So this process of reception, assimilation, and sort of internalization, that is a cultural process. So one should not be unnecessarily alarmed by this. And we should not, in the classroom, I always, there are students who will say, is this poetry? Why should we? So I welcome questions of that kind. So that when you understand what Louis Glick is trying to say, perhaps when you really understand, she may not be the very great poet, but then she has some very good poems. So maybe we actually cross a threshold. We move a little ahead. So I think when I reinvent my way of seeing, I actually see the world differently. You see, the world becomes new for me. I am not the same old person who got up today morning after reading maybe a particular poem. So sometimes when I read a book, Alchemides, I want to run out and tell the world, here is a book. So that's why I write criticism. That is why I write or I speak. You see, there is this great excitement in encountering the new. And if a teacher loses that sense of excitement in discovering the new continuously, then the teacher will actually, the moment you enter the classroom, students will go to sleep. I don't blame the students. I blame the teacher, because you have to, you have to have that passion, that excitement, and that happens when you reinvent yourself continuously.
Well, thank you, sir. I request Dr. Srihari to formally thank the speaker.
Being here with us in this evening with a wonderful presentation, a brand new topic, really it is. On behalf of the LTIF family, I formally thank you, sir. We are all actually inspired by your ideas. As a practicing poet, your poems are included in the global anthology of poetry under lockdown titled Singing in the Dark. And really, it was a great experience to listen to you, sir. And once again, on behalf of the LTIF community, fraternity, and thank you, sir, for everything. Thank you.
May I request Dr. Leena to formally thank the participants who have joined us.
Very good evening, all. Success comes to those who only try. I believe that LTIF tries and tries with genuine interest and envisions the success of people who love and learn English language, who teach English language, who conduct research in English language and literature. This is our 4th online lecture. We are capable of doing all these only because of Dr. Bhaskaran Nair, the president of LTIF. He is our driving force for the conduct of all programs. Be with us, sir, always. Thank you, sir. Thank you so much. And I take this opportunity to give a bouquet of thanks to Dr. Praveen, who is the coordinator of this online program lecture series. And I would like to thank all the committee members. I'm not mentioning all the names. I thank all the committee members. And let me thank all the participants, the wonderful participants. Who made this session an academically rich one with your active participation. We look forward for your cooperation and support in our future activities as well. Once again, thank you all. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Dr. Leena. Once again, on behalf of all the participants present here, I would like to thank Dr. Ramakrishnan, sir, for joining us.
Thank you.